Hello, Emory Baptist. Welcome to Sunday School for Sunday, November 22nd. And we'll be looking today at session 12, which comes out of Isaiah chapter 58, verses 1 through 12. You could probably tell from the decorations behind me that my wife had a little bit of time this week to herself, so that she thought she would just go ahead and decorate for Christmas. And so many of you may be already thinking the same thing. Several people I know have already decorated for Christmas, or maybe you're one of those that's kind of holding on to the idea or the thought of celebrating Thanksgiving, or maybe you're one of those that's decided not to celebrate Thanksgiving this year just to be safe and to make sure everybody's healthy. But a lot of times during this time of year, our thoughts return to that idea of home, that place of comfort and safety and joy and peace. And so as we think about those things, we're looking at Isaiah 58, and the point that we're going to see is that the one true God is just, and he expects his people to demonstrate their faith through right living. Isaiah 58 verses 1 through 5 talk about the true state that Isaiah was pointing out here, the true state of worship of the nation of Israel. It says in verse 1, "Cry out loudly, don't hold back, raise your voices like a ram's horn. Tell my people their transgression and the house of Jacob their sins. They seek me day after day and delight to know my ways, like a nation that does what is right and does not abandon the justice of their God. They ask me for righteous judgments. They delight in nearness to God, nearness of God. Why have we fasted, but you have not seen? Why have we denied ourselves, but you haven't noticed? Look, you do as you please on the day of your fast and oppress all your workers. You fast with contention and strife to strike viciously with your fist. You cannot fast as you do today, hoping to make your voice heard on high. Will the fast I choose be like this, a day for a person to deny himself, to bow his head like a reed and to spread out sackcloth and ashes? Will you call this a fast, a day acceptable to the Lord?" As I read that passage, I thought about a Far Side cartoon where it had this picture of a building that said "School for the Gifted." And standing there on the outside, pushing against the door, was a little boy pushing with all of his might. But the door would not open on the School for the Gifted, because written on the door it said, "Pull." I thought of that picture because that's kind of what's going on. That Israel is shouting out to the Lord, "Why have we fasted and you haven't noticed? Why do we keep doing these religious things, God, and none of it is working?" And God's response, kind of sarcastically, is, "You guys haven't read the sign on the door. You haven't paid attention," right? God is telling Isaiah, raise the alarm. He's telling Isaiah to tell them there's this major disconnect, that he is addressing these complainers, but the problem is that they are accusing God of wrong, and they're the ones that are in the wrong. They say we fasted, but God doesn't pay attention. They say we denied ourselves, but nobody noticed. Well, these religious actions are just religious actions because they're not rooted in the heart of worship. And sometimes we even do that today. We might even say, "God, I'm reading my Bible and I'm praying and I'm going to church and I'm giving money. I'm doing all these things. God, why is none of my things working out? Why am I still facing these struggles?" It's kind of like the celebration of Mardi Gras, which I'm not sure if you know about Mardi Gras. It's actually a religious festival. It's actually, the word Mardi Gras is French for Fat Tuesday. And Fat Tuesday is the day going into the Lenten week, starting with Ash Wednesday. And so on Ash Wednesday, throughout the season of Lent, you would give something up. And so people began to, in their celebration or their observance of Ash Wednesday, they would indulge themselves on Fat Tuesday in whatever they were going to give up for Lent. Well, that began to be its own entity. And so rather than focusing on worshiping the Lord by giving something up and fasting from it in order to draw themselves close to the Lord, it really just became hey, this is a thing we do. And then added on to that, I mean, if you know anything about Mardi Gras, especially associated with the secular celebration of Mardi Gras, It is a very debauched kind of event. And even down in Brazil, they have something called Carnival, which is the same thing. It's this celebration that has turned into this very irreligious, very immoral even celebration that started out as an observance of a religious holiday. God is saying to the people, you're down there saying, hey, we're fasting, we're doing all these things. Why are you not listening? And God is going, because you're celebrating Mardi Gras. Because you are making it just this one small thing that's supposed to look religious, but your heart is very far, very distant. Fasting is not the point if it doesn't point you to God. The purpose of fasting is to demonstrate your reliance upon God. And so in the midst of this religious observance, they are still oppressing and persecuting and fighting. And they're only doing the fasting for a day. It says a day acceptable to the Lord. So there's this duality to their life, that there's this day that they're very religious, but the rest of the week, the rest of their time, they're very irreligious. They're very immoral. In fact, the word that we would use today is the word hypocrite, which comes from this old word that means to wear a mask. And it was talked about of the actors, that they would, in order to show different people in the play, they would put on different masks. And so to be a hypocrite was to put on a mask that wasn't true of the person on the inside. And so today we use that term, a hypocrite, for someone who outwardly expresses something but inwardly lives something completely different. Well, we talk about, so we see the true problem there, the true situation, right? But he says in chapter 58, verses 6 through 10, it points to what true worship looks like. It says in verse 6, "Isn't this the fast I choose? To break the chains of wickedness, to untie the ropes of the yoke, to set the oppressed free, and to tear off every yoke? Is it not to share your bread with the hungry, and to bring the poor and homeless into your house, to clothe the naked when you see him, and not to ignore your own flesh and blood? Then your light will appear like the dawn, and your recovery will come quickly. Your righteousness will go before you, and the Lord's glory will be your rear guard. At that time, when you call, the Lord will answer. When you cry out, he will say, 'Here I am,' if you get rid of the yoke among you, the finger pointing, the malicious speaking. And if you offer yourself to the hungry and satisfy the afflicted one, then your light will shine in the darkness, and your night will be like the noonday." I had a friend of mine make me a little grill top that goes on top of my fire pit that I have outside in my yard. And so I actually sometimes use that grill top to cook hamburgers, or sometimes, whatever, hot dogs or whatever else we may have we want to cook over fire. We'll use that. Well, I used that this past week, and I messaged my friend. I texted my friend and said, "Hey, I really appreciate you having made that for me." And then I thought probably a more tangible expression of that would be for me to invite him over, right? And to cook something for him, rather than just having this quick, flippant toss out of appreciation, which, it's the thought that counts, I'm sure is good, but really, more tangible expressions are much more appreciated. Well, that's the picture that God is using. This obedience to the Lord is not fasting. What it is the obedience to in your seeking the Lord, in your fasting, you begin to do what the Lord has said to do, which is to break the chains of wickedness, of people caught in sin, and to untie the burdens and condemnation of the oppressive religions that were around them. Idol worship, especially in that day, distanced people from God. That they would seek God, but they would seek other idols. They would seek other things to bless them. And when they did that, it separated them from God. It was the disobedience that was breaking them. And so any worship that depended on achievement rather than grace missed the point of what God had called them to. And so these people were discouraged. They were distanced from God, and they couldn't find the answer. They couldn't see where God was. And so God says to Isaiah, take care of others' tangible needs, food, clothing, shelter, and community. This mirrors God's care for people, taking care of their needs. That points us to be others-minded and not focused on ourselves, because the root of sin is actually selfishness, that you would put yourself and your needs and wants before anyone else. That's the root of sin. Well, this obedience points us toward God, and it points us towards others, which actually builds in us grace, which builds in us an affection for other people, and actually builds in us a connection with the Lord, that it points us to the Lord. It demonstrates to us and in us what the Lord has already been like to us. And so there's this genuine demonstration of agape, or a perfect love, that is more like benevolence than it is romance. That there's nothing you're getting out of it, but it's something that's demonstrated towards people that maybe even are undeserving or ill-deserving, right? And so whenever you live like this, you'll have what you're looking for. It says that God says if you'll live in obedience, then you'll have light. And what he's talking about is in actually direct contrast to this people who are walking in darkness, asking God, why haven't you answered? God says, I'll answer you as soon as you start to listen. As soon as you start to respond, you'll see the answer of the Lord. He promises recovery from the brokenness of the sinful life that kept them separated from God's presence, that source of frustration that they were complaining about. He promised them righteousness that goes before them, that they are restored to fellowship with God, that they are no longer at odds with each other. My wife and I, we don't do it very often. We don't get into conflicts where we're at odds with each other, but there have been times in our marriage where we have been at odds with each other. We were upset with each other, and the way that we never got out of relationship with each other, we were just out of fellowship with each other. And as we responded to each other, we came back into fellowship together and enjoying each other's fellowship together. That's the picture here, that God says, if you will stop putting yourself at odds with me, you will enjoy that fellowship. That righteousness will go before you. And it talks about the Lord's glory as your rear guard, this promise of protection throughout the Old Testament, that nobody could slip around you and catch you on the weak side. I got a friend named Dwight who reminds you that 7 out of 10 attacks always come from the rear, right? So you have to be watching for the ones that try to circle around you. Well, Exodus, we see this picture of God becoming a rear wall, a rear guard for the people, especially as the Pharaoh and his army was attacking or chasing down the people of Israel at the Red Sea. It says God put up a wall of fire so that prevented Pharaoh from chasing after Israel into the Red Sea. And so more than anything, whenever they called for God, he would answer, which is such a great promise. God is not a God like the idols that must be coaxed into answering them. I thought about the story of Baal worship on Mount Carmel, where Elijah set himself up against the prophets of Baal, and he told the people, surely, he I guess mocked the prophets of Baal, saying, surely your God is listening. Surely he's trying to hear you. Because the prophets of Baal, they were calling out, they were doing all sorts of things. And it says they even began to cut themselves, kind of in this submission, trying to get Baal to answer. What a hopeless God that was. And God says, listen, I'm not hiding from you. When you call me, I will answer you. He even says in Jeremiah 33:3, call to me and I will answer you and tell you great and unsearchable things you do not know. God's desire is that he and we would understand each other, that when he speaks to us, we would hear, and when we speak to him, he would respond, that we have that connection, that fellowship together. And God promises light, that their obedience to the Lord would make them shine like a light to the surrounding nations. In fact, it says, Isaiah 58, verses 11 and 12, talk about true satisfaction. It says, verse 11, the Lord will always lead you, satisfy you in a parched land, and strengthen your bones. You'll be like a watered garden, like a spring whose water never runs dry. Some of you will rebuild ancient ruins, and you will restore the foundations laid long ago. You will be called the repairer of broken walls, the restorer of streets where people lived. It kind of gives me this picture, this image of the Garden of Eden. And what was lost, what was present in the Garden of Eden that was lost was it wasn't really the benefit of lush vegetation everywhere. It wasn't this ample food supply that was present, but that wasn't the main thing, right? It wasn't this leisurely life of just walking around picking fruits and vegetables and enjoying all the things that God provided. It really wasn't even the lack of laundry responsibilities, right? What was the great benefit of the Garden of Eden that was lost was the presence of the Lord. That Adam and Eve walked with the Lord in the evening, that they spent time in God's presence. Well, here's this promise of restoration that God says that He will lead you, that He will satisfy you in a parched land and strengthen your bones. Well, it kind of gives me this picture of the sheep that we talked about last week. This sheep who is all day he's just eating and he's taken care of, and probably the wool sweater wouldn't be that great, but just to know that if I have the shepherd, then I have everything that I need. And he talks about a well-watered garden, or this refreshing spring, this constant renewal. When I came to Emory Baptist many years ago, Catherine Waldrop told me about the artesian spring over in Canton, where there was this faucet that just comes out of the ground and it's just constantly flowing. And she said she loved to go over and get jugs of water jugs filled up with that artesian spring, that spring water. And whenever she left, she had this desire, this urge to want to turn the faucet off, but you couldn't turn it off. It was constantly flowing because that's what it is. It's a fresh spring that comes out of the ground. Well, that's the picture here, this constantly flowing spring, this constant refreshing. And God talks about rebuilding the ancient ruins, or restoring those foundations, which means reconnecting people to the God who created them and returning them to fellowship with God. Whenever Caleb was about 5 years old and Colby was about 3 or so, we went to the Hunt County Fair one year. And as we were riding the merry-go-round, I was on the ride with the merry-go-round. Lacey and my sister-in-law Tracy, they were standing off to the side. They had decided not to ride that ride because, I don't know, it just went around, I don't know. But as they were standing off to the side, there was a little boy who just burst into tears because he was lost. And as I was riding the ride, Caleb looked over and saw that little boy crying and knew the little boy was lost. And Caleb looked at me and said, I should not have seen that. I should not have seen that. Because what happened to Caleb was he instantly felt that fear of loss. He felt that disconnect that little boy was experiencing. And he thought, what a terrible thing to be disconnected from your parents. And so it's good that my son, that 5-year-old son, had a family who he loves and who loves him. And it's good for him to be a part of people who are restoring. It's good to be a part of people who are connecting him and showing him, demonstrating love toward him. And some of us even right now may be thinking about going home for the holidays, maybe for Thanksgiving or coming up for Christmas, and spending time with people who are familiar to us, people that we know and people who know us. And here's another thought that I thought about. What about us? How are we creating home? How are we creating those spaces where people are known and where people know us and can enjoy us and enjoy that fellowship? Well, that's what God is talking about, that as these Israelites fall into obedience, as they put obedience first and live in fellowship with the Lord, you see that God is restoring and rebuilding those ancient connections that were lost in the garden. That He is restoring people unto Himself, especially through Jesus, who died in our place for our sins and calls us not to come and do a bunch of things, but to know Him and to rest in His grace. And from that point, to respond to what He said to us. That's the picture of home. And so to summarize, let me just give you a few things. Ritual worship, apart from obedience, displeases God, and it ultimately leaves worshipers empty and disillusioned. And meeting the needs of others in obedience to God brings honor to God, but satisfaction comes to those who obediently follow Him. And so let me give you a few questions to think about. Number one, what keeps you from fully obeying what God has said to you? Number two, how can knowing the potential joys of knowing God help you overcome the roadblocks to obedience? And number three, how do these verses demonstrate how God can change a life or a situation in ruin to something beautiful? Let me pray for us and we can move on with the rest of our day. Jesus, I love you. Thank you that you are a God who restores. And Father, I pray that you would help us not to live in meaningless signs of worship, but help us to live in genuine obedience. Help us to live more than just doing these outward signs, God, but that we would respond with our hearts, God. That as we seek you, that we wouldn't have these dead religious actions, but that you would restore us under relationship with yourself through your Son, Jesus. Help us, God, to draw close. Help us to listen and help us to respond. And Father, help us to be among the people who reestablish and who reconnect people who are far from God back to the God who loves them. I love you, Jesus. In your name I pray. Amen.